If you're growing potatoes in a 5-gallon bucket and wondering why you only get a handful of small potatoes at harvest time, there's a good chance you're making the same mistake I made for years without even knowing it. Most gardeners think the problem is fertilizer or watering or maybe the variety they planted. I thought the same thing. But the truth is much simpler, and that's exactly why so many people miss it. A single mistake made during the first few weeks can quietly cut your harvest in half, long before you ever see a green leaf above the soil. The worst part is that the plants often look healthy, so you have no reason to suspect anything is wrong until harvest day arrives, and the bucket that promised a good crop gives you far less than you expected. I remember dumping out my first few buckets and feeling disappointed because the plants looked strong all season. The leaves were green, the stems were thick, everything seemed fine. Then I tipped over the bucket and found only a small cluster of potatoes where I expected twice as many. If this has happened to you, you're not alone. Most people never realize that potatoes in containers follow a few rules that are very different from potatoes grown in the ground. And when those rules are ignored, the plant spends months working hard for very little reward. What makes this even more frustrating is that fixing the problem usually costs nothing. In fact, one of the oldest methods I know actually saves money because it uses less soil and gives the roots a better chance to do what they're supposed to do. Many gardeners overcomplicate container potatoes and end up making things harder than necessary. I learned that lesson the slow way after several disappointing seasons. Then an older gardener showed me something that completely changed the results I was getting from the exact same buckets. The difference wasn't dramatic at first glance. The buckets looked almost identical from the outside. But when harvest time came, the weight of potatoes in my hands told a very different story. Here is where things get interesting, because the mistake has nothing to do with expensive products, and it isn't something you can fix at the end of the season. It starts much earlier than most people think, and once you understand what is really happening inside that bucket, you'll never prepare a potato container the same way again. The reason this mistake causes such a big loss is that potatoes are doing most of their important work where you cannot see it. People naturally pay attention to the leaves because that is the visible part of the plant. When the tops look healthy, we assume everything below the soil must be healthy too. I used to think exactly the same way. If the plant was tall and green, I felt confident that harvest day would be a good one. What I did not understand was that a potato plant can look perfectly happy while quietly producing far fewer potatoes underground. That is where most gardeners get fooled. They judge the plant by what they can see instead of by what is actually happening inside the bucket. Have you ever noticed how two potato plants can look almost identical all summer? Yet one bucket produces a heavy harvest, and the other gives only a small pile of potatoes. There is a reason for that, and it begins during planting. Most people fill the entire bucket with soil right from the start, and then place the seed potato near the top. It feels logical because the bucket looks full and ready to grow. I did that for years. The plants grew fast and looked strong. But here is the real problem. The potato plant was never encouraged to develop the underground structure needed for a larger harvest. The bucket was full, but much of that space was not being used in the way I expected. When harvest came, I found that many potatoes were crowded into a small area, while the rest of the bucket contributed very little. That was a frustrating discovery, because I had spent money on soil and fertilizer without getting the results I wanted. Most people do not know this because nobody sees the problem until the season is over. By then, it is too late to change anything. This is why so many gardeners repeat the same mistake year after year. The plant survives. The leaves look fine. A few potatoes appear. Nothing seems obviously wrong, but the harvest never reaches its potential. An older gardener pointed this out to me many years ago. He said that container potatoes reward patience more than effort. At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Later, I realized he was talking about a simple method that allows the plant to build itself gradually instead of forcing everything at the beginning. And once I started using that method, the difference became impossible to ignore. The surprising part is that the first step feels almost backwards, and that is exactly why so many people skip it. What finally changed my results was learning that a potato bucket should not begin the season completely full. I know that sounds strange because most of us were taught that more soil must mean more room for growth. That was my thinking too. I would fill a 5-gallon bucket nearly to the top and feel satisfied that I had given the plant everything it needed. Then I would wonder why the harvest never matched my expectations. The old gardener who helped me showed me a different approach. He told me to start with only part of the bucket filled and let the plant earn the rest of the space as it grows. At first I doubted him because it seemed like I was taking something away from the plant instead of helping it. But I decided to try it on one bucket while keeping another bucket planted the way I had always done it. By the middle of the season, both plants looked healthy. In fact, I could barely tell them apart. If I had stopped there, I would have assumed the experiment was a waste of time. But Harvest Day told a different story. The bucket planted with the older method produced noticeably more potatoes, and many of them were larger. That was the moment I realized how much potential I had been losing. Here is why this matters. As the potato plant grows upward, you can gradually add more soil around the lower stem. Most people have heard about this, but many either skip it or do it incorrectly. They wait too long or add too much at once, or never leave enough room in the bucket to do it properly. The plant then misses an opportunity to develop the way it was designed to. Little by little, the harvest potential shrinks. Not overnight and not in a way you can easily see. That is what makes the mistake so costly. The good news is that correcting it requires no expensive tools and no special products. In fact, it often saves soil because you are using the bucket more efficiently from the beginning. Most gardeners spend time looking for better fertilizer when the real improvement comes from setting up the bucket correctly during the first few weeks. This changes everything because it means better harvests are often possible with the same bucket, the same variety, and the same amount of work. But there is another mistake hiding behind this one, and it may be even more damaging because it affects people who think they are already using the right method. I made that mistake too, and it took me several seasons to understand why it was quietly limiting my harvest. The next mistake is one that catches many gardeners because they believe they are doing exactly what they should. I certainly thought I was. After learning to start with less soil in the bucket, I became confident that my potato harvests would keep improving every year. For a while they did. Then I noticed something strange. Some buckets produced very well while others still lagged behind even though I planted them the same way. That puzzled me because I thought I had already solved the big problem. It took several seasons before I realized that the timing of adding soil mattered almost as much as the soil itself. Most people either rush this step or forget about it until the plants have already grown too tall. I was guilty of both. Sometimes life got busy, and I told myself I would add more soil in a few days. Then a few days became a week or two. The plants kept growing, and I assumed everything would be fine. But here is where things get interesting. Potato plants respond best when that extra soil is added gradually as the stems develop. When you wait too long, the plant has already invested much of its energy elsewhere. You cannot simply fix everything in one afternoon by dumping a large amount of soil into the bucket. I learned that lesson the hard way. One year I had several buckets that looked fantastic from a distance. The plants were tall and healthy. Friends who visited my garden expected a huge harvest. Yet when I emptied those buckets, I found far fewer potatoes than I expected. That experience taught me something valuable. Healthy leaves do not always predict a heavy harvest. Most people do not know this because they judge success during the growing season instead of at harvest time. The old gardener who shared these methods with me used to walk through his garden every few days and check the height of the stems. He never made it complicated. He simply paid attention. When the plants reached the right stage, he added a little more soil and moved on. It took only a few minutes, but the results were remarkably consistent. That simple habit became one of the most useful things I ever adopted. It cost nothing. It required no special equipment. Yet it often made the difference between an average harvest and a bucket full of potatoes worth showing to friends and neighbors. But even after fixing that issue, I discovered another problem that many container gardeners overlook completely. In fact, this next mistake often begins before the seed potato even goes into the bucket, and it can quietly reduce the harvest from the very start. The mistake that surprised me the most had nothing to do with adding soil and nothing to do with fertilizer. It started before planting day, and for years I never paid much attention to it. Like many gardeners, I would grab a seed potato and put it into the bucket as soon as I was ready. I figured that if the potato was healthy enough to sprout, then it was healthy enough to plant. Sometimes that worked reasonably well. Other times the results were disappointing and I could never understand why. The plants emerged at different speeds. Some grew vigorously, while others seemed to spend weeks trying to catch up. At first I blamed the weather. Then I blamed the soil. Eventually, I learned that the condition of the seed potato before planting can influence the entire season. An older gardener showed me a simple habit that many people have forgotten. He would allow the seed potatoes to develop short, sturdy sprouts before they ever touched the soil. He was patient about it and never rushed the process. At the time, I thought it seemed unnecessary. After all, potatoes want to grow anyway. Why wait? But when I compared the results for myself, the difference became obvious. The plants started more evenly and established themselves faster. That may not sound important at first, but in a container, every week of healthy growth matters. A potato plant growing in a 5-gallon bucket has limited space and limited time to produce. If it spends part of the season struggling to get started, it rarely makes up for that lost time later. Most gardeners do not realize this because the delay often happens early when excitement is high and attention is focused on planting. By the time harvest arrives, the connection is easy to miss. Here is where things get interesting. Many people spend money searching for larger harvests while ignoring simple preparation that costs absolutely nothing. That old method of encouraging short, sturdy sprouts requires patience more than money. It fits perfectly with the kind of gardening I appreciate now. Simple steps, no fancy products, real results. I began using this approach consistently and noticed that my buckets became more predictable from year to year. Instead of hoping for a good harvest, I could expect one. That sense of control is worth a lot to any gardener. But there is still another mistake that quietly cuts production. And it is probably the most common one of all, because almost everyone believes they are helping their potatoes when they are actually creating a problem that follows the plant through the entire season. The next mistake is so common that I still catch people doing it every season, and I understand why, because I did exactly the same thing for years. It comes from good intentions. We see a potato plant growing strongly in a bucket, and we want to help it even more. So we give it extra water whenever the surface looks dry. We add a little more because the weather is warm. Then we add a little more because we do not want the plant to suffer. Before long, the bucket is staying wetter than it should, and the gardener feels confident that the potatoes are being well cared for. That was my thinking. The problem is that potatoes do not reward constant over-attention. In fact, some of my weakest harvests came during seasons when I spent the most time trying to help. Have you ever had a bucket where the plant looked healthy at first, but later seemed to lose energy even though you kept watering regularly? If so, you are not alone. Most people assume that more water automatically means more growth. But here is the real problem. A potato plant needs moisture, but it also needs conditions that allow the roots and developing potatoes to function properly. When the bucket stays too wet for too long, the plant can never fully settle into a healthy rhythm. The frustrating part is that the symptoms are often subtle. The leaves may still look acceptable. The plant may continue growing. Nothing dramatic happens overnight. Yet the harvest slowly pays the price. An older gardener once told me something that stayed with me. He said the goal is not to keep the bucket wet. The goal is to keep the plant comfortable. Those are not always the same thing. At first I thought that sounded overly simple, but the more experience I gained, the more accurate it proved to be. I started paying closer attention to the actual condition of the soil rather than watering by habit. The results improved. The buckets became more consistent. The harvests became heavier. Best of all, it saved time and water. That is the kind of solution I appreciate because it costs nothing and removes unnecessary work instead of adding more chores. Many gardeners overcomplicate potatoes when the best results often come from a few steady habits repeated throughout the season. Little by little, those habits add up. By harvest time, the difference can be surprisingly large. And now we arrive at the final piece of the puzzle because there is one simple way to judge whether your bucket setup is truly working. Most people never think about it until the season is over, but once you know what to look for, you can avoid repeating the same mistakes year after year. When harvest day finally arrives, most gardeners focus on one thing. How many potatoes came out of the bucket? That number certainly matters, but over the years, I learned to pay attention to something else as well. I look at the entire bucket after it is emptied and ask myself a simple question. Did the plant actually use the space I gave it? This small habit taught me more than any gardening book ever could. Every bucket becomes a lesson. If most of the potatoes are crowded into one small area, then something during the season probably limited the plant. If the bucket contains a good spread of healthy potatoes from top to bottom, then I know the setup worked well. That simple observation helped me improve my harvests year after year without spending extra money. Looking back, I realized that the biggest mistake with a 5-gallon potato bucket is not a lack of fertilizer or a lack of expensive products. The real mistake is assuming that a healthy-looking plant automatically means a productive one. I made that assumption for a long time, and it quietly cost me a large portion of my harvest. Once I began paying attention to how the bucket was prepared, from the beginning, everything started to change. Starting with the right amount of soil, adding more at the proper time, using well-prepared seed potatoes, avoiding the urge to overwater. None of these steps are difficult. None of them require special skills. Yet together, they can make an enormous difference. That is why I still recommend these older methods. They have been around for years because they work. Many gardeners overlook them because they seem too simple. We often believe the answer must be complicated when the truth is usually much easier. What I like most about these habits is that they save money rather than cost money. You do not need bigger containers. You do not need expensive equipment. You simply need to avoid a few common mistakes that quietly reduce the harvest before the season is halfway over. If this happened to you in the past, there is no reason to be discouraged. Every gardener learns through experience. I certainly did. The good news is that potatoes give us another chance every season. One bucket can teach you something valuable, and the next bucket can reward you for applying that lesson. That is part of what keeps gardening interesting, even after many years. And once you see the difference for yourself, it becomes very difficult to go back to the old way, because you know exactly how much harvest was being left behind all along.